As we talk about indigenous knowledge, again, we're really reframing what does that mean. The Standing Rock issue in North Dakota, many Standing Rocks in the world. It's just one that happens, perhaps could be a tipping point. Same way there's many water issues in the world. And maybe, again, that's another tipping point. And depending how people see their own ritual in their life, what we try to do is to drink water in the morning, first thing we do. Kind of remind ourselves about water, how important it is, and that many, many people in the world don't have drinkable water. So then that becomes an indigenous argument, not necessarily, but it's a concept that we relate to how we start a day. Scientific knowledge might have some science to explain what's a good water, what's treatable water, what's potable, there's a whole definition going into what is science water. When we see water in our indigenous knowledge and in our ceremonies and in our prayers, we have talking about the concept of all water. It's inclusive of all water there are on the earth, not just Oneida water. It's about all the water, all the trees, all the plants, all the animals. And it's not exclusive where we're just talking about my jurisdiction sometimes and my scientific knowledge goes up to the border because the American knowledge, the science is up to the border. Canadian knowledge is on the other side. Doesn't necessarily mean they agree. And in the indigenous community, there's kind of an indigenousness of that worldview. And I believe the indigenous wildcard, so to speak, puts some new opportunities to have a discussion. The Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, with their victories in Supreme Courts, have elevated another conversation about ceded territory. Well, where's that? Find that in a land tenure book. It's a new concept, fairly new concept. That now has validity. The Supreme Court said so, for one. And then management of resources becomes the focus as much as managing just Indian resources. So it's changing dynamics of the discussion. Well, I think the coasts usually have a certain different type of dynamics in what they deal with. And there's been bi-coastal discussions recently on climate change. Planning efforts have been going on for some time. Pacific Northwest certainly is one area that's been dealing with international impacts, as we all have, but certainly there a little more. You can see it statistically. And Great Lakes, because of the watershed, certainly is another place in North America that has a lot. But then you start to get in South America, as you look at indigenous worldview, you get in South America, there's dynamics there around the water relationships. And then where they're issues about humans, not issues about black people or white people or indigenous people. So clean water seems to be a universal issue, global issue. Clean air, so, and then what's our contribution to making it poor air and water? And then what's our responsibility to make it clean air and water? I think that's where we got to bring that distance between those discussions more closer together.
We live right here by one of the most beautiful, most precious, valuable pieces of resource in the world, Lake Superior. And not only do we have to have safeguards against that for climate change, but there's a lot of people that aren't getting any water. And when you have a big bathtub of water, people are going to want that. So I mean, that's my concern. I'll say this, and you can put this anywhere and tell anybody. There is not a treaty that has been signed that has given up our rights to that mineral and that resource. None. There's none in existence. And so if we don't all start carrying that torch as Native people, guess what? They're going to start taking your resource. And you're going to have a battle on your hands. And the thing is that we're so reactionary, Native people, it's all about reaction. It's got to be proactive and start buckling it down and saying, hey, we didn't sign that away. We didn't give that to anybody. That belongs to us. See, that's where my dad and my uncle, even not knowing anything about those things, they understood that this was for them. This is for their life. And that's the way they raised me. It's raised my family. That's what's important for us. Those are the things that are important. That's our life. And we've got adults right now that are living here in this community that don't really have a clue with regard to what we all did in order for us to be able to go out and spearfish, to go out and set nets, to go out and shoot deer, to do the thing. We've got a really uphill battle even right now to maintain that and keep that going, because you can lose it in a heartbeat. But the important thing right now is documenting this, and just so that somebody says, "Oh, yeah, I remember that. I heard that." So we can all put that back and say that's what we need to do. You know, we plan without even planning. We know, even living here, there's 21 miles of lakeshore that are within the boundaries of the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior Chippewa Indians. Now you go ride that lakeshore. You start from Bayfield and you ride it, go all the way around. You hit Red Cliff, you're going to see very, very limited amount of development, small amount of development. Well, we didn't have any idea that that's what we were doing, but guess what? That's what we're doing. We're preserving that lakeshore without even knowing it, just because we don't want the development. So we preserve that. Then you go on beyond under our western side of our reservation. There you go. Boop, 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 boop. Houses all over, big houses, money all over the place, you know. People wonder why we don't want to give people access. That's why, because we want our place to be here.
We have a lot of individuals who live on allotment lands, and when these lands were allotted out for Native Americans, they didn't get the choice parcels. So you find a lot of people that are in lowlands and low-lying areas, bogs and swamps, essentially with very little buildable areas. A lot of concern is with rising water tables and the different things that are occurring, which they feel can be attributed to climate change at this point, is that they're seeing more flooding in their basements, they're seeing creek levels rising, they're seeing water tables starting to creep up more and more, and they wonder if it is going to impact to the point where their lands are going to become unlivable.
Water is going to be the big topic. It is the big topic. I mean, it is a huge topic, and people, it seems odd to say it where we live. We have such great access to fresh water, but that's not always going to be the case. And obviously, that's a competing resource. So.
About 6 or 7 years ago, Professor Ken Potter and myself convened a group of municipal stormwater managers and municipal utility managers, mostly wastewater utilities, to talk about what the impacts of extreme rainfall and climate change might be to them and their operations. And we brought that group together here in Madison. We had several working groups that moved forward and developed different recommendations for communities in terms of how they might manage their infrastructure and stormwater more effectively to reduce potential damage and increase public safety. What we've learned, I think, from working with Center for Climatic Research and WICI is that the hydrological cycle in Wisconsin is changing. It has been changing a little bit over the last 25 years. We expect it to continue that trend. That includes slightly more annual precipitation, but a shift in the precipitation's timing, so that we would expect that more rainfall and snowfall in the winter, not so much in the late summer. And as temperatures are rising, we expect that winter and spring snowfall and rainfall to be more often liquid than it has been in the past, and that includes things like ice storms, which at one time were more common south of us in Illinois and Missouri and Arkansas, seem to be moving up in the upper Midwest so that they're becoming more common for us. That also would lead us to think that because of the rain precipitation in the spring, that we would see more groundwater recharge, that more of that water being soaked into the water table rather than being transpired into the atmosphere by plants that are not quite yet greened out. And so we're looking at higher groundwater tables, more recharge to drinking water supplies. Along with those sort of broad seasonal trends, though, there are indications that as the atmosphere warms, that we would expect the type of convective thunderstorms and heavy rainfall that we see to become more frequent and have heavier rainfall than they had in the past. And that's obviously concerning because those are the types of events that create both short-term flash floods in a municipal environment or long-term flooding in more of a river setting. So one of the things that is indirectly connected to the work that I do, because I mostly deal with urban stormwater, is the fact that as we get more runoff on land that doesn't have plants growing on it, it might be an agricultural field that's been cultivated recently or had manure spread on it, but plants haven't germinated because it's raining now in February and March. We'll see more soil loss, runoff, nutrients entering our lakes and streams. All of that will lead to more sedimentation, and ultimately we are afraid more of the blue-green algal blooms that have some toxicity as temperatures warm and we have more nutrients going into lakes and streams. We've seen in the last 10 years or so incidences like the 2008 Baraboo River flood, which was an example of a weather impact that was driven by our climate. And we had a long period of heavy snowfall in the previous winter. We had heavy rainfall following up with an extreme rainfall storm over the course of about 7 to 14 days. And the result of that was the flooding of the Interstate 94-39 around Portage, and that cut off a major transportation route for the state for 4 or 5 days while the water had to recede and the roadway needed to dry out. We have seen other types of situations where extreme flooding might cause undermining, as in some of the big sinkhole problems they had in downtown Milwaukee. Certainly bridges are at risk from heavy flows from rivers caused by more rainfall. So I think those types of transportation infrastructures need to be taken into account. Can people get to work? Can people get to the hospital if they need to? How long would roads be flooded and impassable in the case of a heavy rainfall over the course of several days? Those are the type of questions that when we work with communities, we ask them to think about carefully and think about ways that they might be able to prevent those interruptions of our normal working and daily life. We worked with, most recently, Dane County government to address this question. And the way that we were to do that was to convene the department heads from all the different county departments. It could be the airport, transportation, the zoo, facilities management, the sheriff's department. We brought these folks together and we briefed them or educated them a little bit on what we saw as changing climate in Wisconsin, what had changed in the last 20 or 25 years that we have measurements for, what we expect to be changing over the next 20, 25 years. We identified some very specific trends, and I spoke earlier about the trends in precipitation and rainfall. And then we gave them the task of sitting down and, as a small group, working through exactly what part of their county government management would be affected by changes in climate. What would these trends mean for how you operate a zoo, whether the airport is going to be open 365 days a year, or if flooding is going to be a problem. If the sheriff's department needs to be better prepared to go out into ice storms and inclement weather that was once infrequent and is going to be more frequent, what type of equipment do they need? And so they helped us identify all the different aspects of their county government where climate had an impact and what exactly the scope of that impact was, and then what they could do about that and over what time frame they might be thinking about that, because these climate changes are long-term. The weather impacts today are much different than they were 25 years ago and will be different again 25 years in the future. And so we have a time period in which we can begin to gradually adapt to those projected changes and the ones that have taken place and become more resilient as communities. And as a result of that work that we did with Dane County, they have changed their annual budget to include adaptation activities, equipment, and organizational restructuring that allows them to be more resilient for things like extreme rainfall, heavy ice storms, long heat waves, those type of things. The types of interactions that we've used that seem to be the most effective are when we bring together professionals that work with infrastructure and government that have long planning horizons, that are thinking already strategically. Are they going to extend their wastewater treatment system? Are they going to be building new highways? What about water supply for a community? Will they need to drill new wells? Those are all decisions that look ahead 10, 15, or 20 years. And the future climate is a very important part of that decision making. And those people are receptive to including this type of information in the choices that they make. For any community in Wisconsin, the most important thing that you need to be able to do is understand how your stormwater infrastructure has been sized and created in the past. And if it was put in place using stormwater runoff models, do those models need to be adjusted for current and future rainfall amounts? If it was, as is often the case, the highway department figured that a 36-inch culvert would be adequate here, and so that's what they put in, then someone needs to be going out and looking at that infrastructure during the rainfall events and saying, we had 3 inches of rain in 24 hours. How did that perform? Did we have water going over the top of the road? Do we need a larger culvert there? Do we need to be thinking about what's upstream of that culvert that's causing that? So it's a question of not simply responding to failures in the infrastructure, but analyzing and carefully looking at how the infrastructure performs under current conditions and trying to visualize and model whether or not, as conditions change, that infrastructure should be modified. Groundwater is a very interesting question because two things are happening. One is we think that groundwater recharge is beginning to increase as we get more spring and winter rainfall. At the same time, we are also seeing more and more agricultural irrigation wells being put in to take care of short-term 3, 4, 5-week droughts in late summer. What is the relationship between those additional irrigation wells, groundwater supply for communities, and groundwater that feeds lakes and rivers and springs around the state? This is an area that I think we're going to see more study and research done in the next 5 or 10 years. But I'm hoping that as the weather patterns change and we see more of this non-growing season precipitation, that we will have increased groundwater availability. The flip side of that, of course, is that means that the water table in low-lying areas is probably going to rise. Areas that have historically had either wetlands or areas that maybe 1 year out of 10 was too wet to plow in a field might become more open water, might be unable to plow that property, that field for 4 out of 5 years. How are people going to change their use of the land as we see groundwater rising as well? So that's another question that needs more looking at. Especially, I think, in urban service areas where we have wastewater treatment collection systems that are subject to what's called infiltration from groundwater leaking into the systems, putting excess demand on the wastewater treatment plant in terms of the number of gallons that they have to treat. So it's a very complicated scenario, lots of really interesting questions to ask and problems to solve in the future. And the main thing is for practitioners, whether they work for a government or a consulting firm, or if they're at the university, to just be aware that conditions are changing into the future. We need to be thinking about how that affects the work that we do.